Girls. Hello boys and girls. Today we're going to read Little Miss Tiny by Roger Hargreaves. Are you ready? Are you sitting comfy? Okay, let's get started. Okay, so Little Miss Tiny by Roger Hargreaves. Little Miss Tiny was extremely small. Not very tall at all. She was very tiny. She didn't realize she didn't live in a house. Do you know where she lived? In a mouse hole. In the dining room of Home Farm. There's the mouse hole. And this story is about Little Miss Tiny. She had made the mouse hole quite comfortable, really, and luckily there weren't any mice because a farm cat had chased them all away. The trouble was, because she was so tiny, nobody knew that she lived there. Nobody had noticed her, not even the farmer and his wife. So there she lived, all alone, with nobody to talk to. She was very lonely and sad. Oh dear, there she is, Little Miss Tiny. One day she was feeling so lonely she decided to be very brave and go for a walk. Out of her mouse hole she came. She crept down the dining room and went through the crack in the door and into the hole. There she is, sneaking through the house, Little Miss Tiny. To Little Miss Tiny, the hole looked as big as a field, and she scuttled across it to the back door of the farm. Luckily for her, the letterbox was at the bottom of the door, and she squeezed herself through it and onto the doorstep. It was all very exciting. Then, before her was the farmyard. She went exploring. She came to a door with a gap at the bottom and ducked in underneath. There she is, exploring. There inside was a pig, a large pig. And if you're small as Little Miss Tiny, a large pig looks very large indeed. Miss Tiny looked at the pig. The pig looked at Miss Tiny. Oink, he grunted and moved closer to inspect this little person who had entered his sty. Oh my goodness me, squeaked Little Miss Tiny in alarm and shot out of the pigsty as fast as her little legs could carry her, which wasn't very fast because her legs were so little. She ran around the back of the pigsty before she stopped and leaned against the wall and pushed her hands over her eyes and tried to get her breath back. There she is. Suddenly she heard a noise, a very close noise, a sort of breathing noise, very close indeed. She hardly dared to take her hands away from her eyes, but when she did, she wished she hadn't. What do you think it was there, right in front of her, looking at her with green eyes? Oh, I wonder what it is. She's very small, see? She's very small. So it could be a lot. Oh, this page is a bit tricky. Ginger, the farm cat. Poor Little Miss Tiny. Ginger grinned and showed his teeth. Help! Shrieked Miss Tiny at the top of her voice. Oh, somebody, please help. The trouble was, the top of Little Miss Tiny's voice was not a very loud place. Ginger grinned another grin. Every day, Mr. Strong went to the home farm to buy some eggs. He liked eggs, lots of them. That day he was walking home across the farmyard when he heard a very tiny squeak. He stopped. There it was again. Round the corner. He looked around the corner and saw Ginger and the poor trapped Little Miss Tiny. Shoo, said Mr. Strong to Ginger and picked up Little Miss Tiny. Very gently. Hello, he said. Who are you? I'm Miss Tiny. You are, aren't you? Smiled Mr. Strong. Well, if I was as tiny as you, I wouldn't be going wandering around large farmyards. But, said Mr. Tiny, and told Mr. Strong about how she was so lonely and how she came out to find somebody to talk to. Oh dear, said Mr. Strong. Well now, let's see if we can't find you some friends to talk to. There's Mr. Strong and little Miss Tiny. Oh, this one's tricky. And now, every week, Mr. Strong collects little Miss Tiny and takes her off to see his friends. Isn't that lovely? 3 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Funny, who told her so many jokes she couldn't stop laughing. There's Mr. Funny. 2 weeks ago, he took her to see Mr. Greedy. He told her his recipe for his favourite meal. But that's too much. That's much, much too much for tiny little me, she laughed. Mr. Greedy grinned. For you, he said, divide by 100. She's so tiny. There's Mr. Greedy. Last week, Mr. Strong took her to see Mr. Silly, and Mr. Silly showed her how to stand on your head. That's very silly, giggled little Miss Tiny. Thank you, replied Mr. Silly modestly. There's Mr. Silly, he's standing on his head. And guess who she met this week? Someone who will become a special little friend. I never thought I'd meet anyone smaller than myself, laughed Mr. Small. Little Miss Tiny looked up at him and smiled. You wait till I grow up, she said. Little Miss Tiny by Roger Hargreaves.